Have you ever felt like the world is constantly, teetering on the brink of chaos, yet somehow it often just pulls back? How do vastly different cultures and powerful nations even attempt to weave together some semblance of global order? That's the enormous question Henry Kissinger tackles in his, well, seminal 2014 book, World Order. And that's the heart of our deep dives today. This isn't just a book report, though. Our deep dive pulls insights directly from multiple summaries, analyses of Kissinger's extensive work. We want to give you a concise but, pretty comprehensive understanding. Our mission today: to quickly and thoroughly unpack Kissinger's historical perspective, his concept of different global orders, and his vision for navigating the incredibly complex, multipolar world we live in now in the 21st century. Think of it as your shortcut to understanding the profound forces shaping international relations. It might give you a fresh lens on today's headlines.
Absolutely. And it's a perspective informed by, well, a lifetime of experience. Kissinger, a veteran statesman, former U.S. Secretary of State. He really brings his vast experience from both academia and high-level diplomacy to this major work. He manages to distill some incredibly complex issues into a format that's accessible for a popular audience, which is quite a feat, really, when you're dealing with topics this dense.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Kissinger titled his book World Order, singular, but is he actually arguing for one universal order? Or is it maybe more nuanced than that? What exactly did he mean by world order, and where does he trace its sort of modern origins?
That's a great place to start because it's precisely that nuance he explores. For Kissinger, world order isn't some fixed, singular blueprint that fits everyone. Instead, it's a concept deeply shaped by history, culture, philosophy. It addresses how different civilizations understand political legitimacy.
Legitimacy, meaning like the right to rule.
Exactly, the accepted right to rule or exercise power. And it also covers the distribution of power and how different places define stability itself. Now, when we talk about the modern world order, he traces its roots directly back to the Westphalian system that emerged in 1648.
Ah, the Peace of Westphalia. That rings a bell from history class.
Ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, right?
Hmm,
Established some kind of state system.
precisely. It was absolutely pivotal in European history. Its core principles were state sovereignty, meaning each state has exclusive authority over its own territory, non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states, and crucially, the balance of power. The idea was that no single state should get so dominant it could threaten others. You aim for a kind of equilibrium.
Okay.
And its success within Europe was, well, undeniable for a time. It prevented the continent from collapsing back into endless religious wars. And significantly, it defined procedure rather than substance. This meant states could interact and recognize each other, regardless of their internal beliefs or who was actually in charge. So it created a pragmatic framework for interaction. Basically, agree to disagree on internal stuff, but agree on the rules of the road for external things. That sounds incredibly ingenious for its time.
It absolutely was. It brought a degree of order to a continent just ravaged by religious conflict. But here's Kissinger's key argument about its fundamental weakness and maybe why he calls the book World Order singular, not plural.
Hmm.
He argues it was never truly universal. It worked primarily within Europe.
Right.
And while European colonialism later, imposed this system abroad, it wasn't based on mutual acceptance by the non-European powers. It was an export, not a shared agreement or something that grew organically elsewhere.
So if the Westphalian system wasn't a truly universal agreement, just a European export, that really reframes how we think about the foundation of international relations, doesn't it? It suggests the one-size-fits-all approach we often assume might be, well, fundamentally flawed globally. What does that challenge about our current diplomatic assumptions?
It challenges the very idea that there's a default, universally accepted set of rules governing how nations interact. If the bedrock principles, like state sovereignty and non-interference, came from a specific historical and cultural context, Europe in the 17th century, then trying to just slap them onto civilizations with entirely different histories and ideas about order, that's bound to create friction. It means true global cooperation is inherently difficult because the very rules of the game, as you put it, aren't shared by everyone.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because Kissinger emphasizes that outside of Europe, major powers like China, the Islamic world, India, and of course the United States, they developed alternative visions of legitimacy and order. So what does this all mean for understanding today's global landscape where all these different visions are kind of colliding?
It means the central challenge of our time, according to Kissinger, is figuring out how to reconcile these vastly different visions into a single workable global system. Each region's historical story and cultural background profoundly shape its approach to international relations. It often leads to very different priorities, different interpretations of global events. It's almost like, everyone's playing chess, but with fundamentally different rule books, and maybe even different ideas of what winning even looks like.
Let's start with the United States then, given its huge role in shaping the post-World War II order. How does Kissinger characterize America's vision? How does it mix with its actions?
The U.S. vision is unique. It's this fascinating blend of realism and idealism.
Hmm.
It's deeply rooted in the Puritan idea of a city upon a hill, this notion that America sees itself as a moral example to the world, striving to spread its values, its system. You could see this thread in the Monroe Doctrine back in 1823,
Yeah.
asserting regional dominance, but also, interestingly, having an anti-colonial stance, sort of setting the stage for American exceptionalism.
Right.
Later, Woodrow Wilson pushed hard for a rules-based international system with the League of Nations. He aimed to spread democracy and universal values globally. Kissinger highlights that during the Cold War, the U.S. constantly had to balance this sort of missionary zeal for spreading democracy with the very pragmatic geopolitics of containing the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
He argues the U.S. must continue to balance this idealism with pragmatic diplomacy. Its global role isn't just about moral leadership. It's about skillful statecraft in a world full of diverse interests.
That tension between what America maybe believes it should do and what's practical, that seems like a constant theme in U.S. foreign policy. It makes you wonder how much of that idealism is truly understood or even welcomed by other powers. What about China? Their rapid rise is so central today, and their historical context is profoundly different.
Oh, absolutely. China historically saw itself as the Middle Kingdom, the actual center of civilization, not just one nation among equals. Their historical practice wasn't Westphalian diplomacy based on sovereign equals. It was more about expecting tribute from other states, seeing diplomacy as hierarchical.
Very different.
Completely. So its current rise is therefore a fundamental test of the existing global order. It challenges established norms precisely because its historical worldview is so non-Westphalian. How do you integrate a power that historically saw itself as the universal center into a system built on the idea of sovereign equals? That's a huge question.
And Russia, another major player, complex history, often feels at odds with that Western-centric view.
Right. Russia has always kind of seen itself as neither fully European or fully Asian, occupying its own vast Eurasian space. Its history, from the Tsarist Empire through the Soviet Union, is one of expansion, often driven by a perceived need for security and at times, ideological ambition. Post-Soviet Russia, especially under Putin, Kissinger describes as insecure, resentful of NATO and EU expansion, actively seeking to restore its strength and resist what it sees as Western dominance, building more of a Eurasian identity. Kissinger's insight here is pretty powerful. For stability, Russia's search for respect and security must be recognized. But it's a tightrope walk, isn't it?
How do you recognize that search without validating or enabling aggression?
Exactly. It's about understanding their historical narrative, their perspective, even if you strongly disagree with their actions.
Okay, moving to the Middle East. A region often described as incredibly volatile. Kissinger actually labels it a world in disorder. What threads does he pull together to explain that?
Well, he paints a pretty grim picture. Unlike the secular Westphalian model, Islam historically fused religion and politics. That's a fundamental difference. Then the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which had imposed some degree of order, left behind fragmented states, often with artificial borders. He points to forces like Arab nationalism, Zionism, radical Islamism, plus U.S. interventions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, as factors that have continually disrupted any regional balance.
So multiple layers of conflict and competing ideas.
Absolutely. The region faces profound challenges. Intense sectarian conflict, especially Sunni-Shia divisions, and then jihadism, which actively threatens state sovereignty by operating across borders. Kissinger argues the region currently lacks a clear, agreed-upon regional order. Its internal conflicts often spill over, impacting global stability. And just briefly, Iran is a deeply complex case within this, seen both as a revolutionary power exporting an ideology and a nation-state seeking recognition. The nuclear issue really embodies this clash between order and revolution. It's a region where the Westphalian map feels very fragile.
Wow, that really drives home how different these foundational views of order are. What about Asia, beyond China? You have powers like Japan and India, each with unique histories.
All right, Japan is a fascinating case study in adaptation. It successfully adopted and adapted the Western Westphalian system after the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, became a modern industrial power very quickly. India, on the other hand, is an ancient civilization, went through a long period of colonialism, and is now emerging as a major democratic power, but with its own distinct historical and philosophical underpinnings. Kissinger proposes that for stability, Asia, given its immense diversity and rising powers, needs some kind of concert of powers, including China, India, Japan, the U.S., others, to manage things and avoid conflict, especially with a rising China testing the U.S. presence and regional dynamics.
Yeah.
So if we connect all this back to the bigger picture, it just highlights how deeply historical narratives and cultural backgrounds shape a nation's foreign policy and its vision for how the world should work. It's not just about military might or economics. It's also about these deeply ingrained ideas of legitimacy, identity, and how the world should be organized. Ignoring those historical lenses, that would be a profound mistake in diplomacy today.
So, given these fundamentally different, deeply ingrained ideas of order across the globe, what does this all mean for our very modern, interconnected world? Especially with rapid technological change and new forms of conflict that don't really respect borders. How do Kissinger's insights speak to these 21st century challenges?
Well, Kissinger's analysis identifies several new destabilizing forces. Forces that challenge the traditional world order, things that just didn't exist or weren't as potent back in 1648. First, technology. We're talking cyber warfare, the
Right.
rapid advance of artificial intelligence, the potential for biological weapons.
Yeah.
These create unprecedented threats. They can bypass traditional defenses, blur the lines between peace and war. A cyber attack isn't a conventional invasion, right? But it can be absolutely devastating.
Meaning state boundaries and conventional military power are less effective against them, and the whole concept of state sovereignty gets undermined.
Precisely. Which leads directly to the second point, terrorism. Terrorist networks operate outside state boundaries. They directly erode those traditional Westphalian assumptions about state control and sovereignty. They don't respect borders or national allegiances in the traditional way. And then there's the ongoing threat of nuclear weapons. Their proliferation undermines stability, especially if deterrence fails or if they fall into the wrong hands. Kissinger recognized back in 2014 that the nuclear age fundamentally altered the balance of power. It added this dimension of, well, apocalyptic risk to statecraft.
So the essential takeaway here is that the traditional world order, conceived in a different era, just has to fundamentally adapt to these new potent dimensions of power. The old rules aren't enough. This raises a huge question, though. How do we even begin to manage these global challenges when different powers have such fundamentally different ideas about how the world should be organized, and the threats themselves are evolving so fast?
That's really the crux of Kissinger's conclusion. He argues pretty forcefully that world order cannot be imposed by a single power. It must be negotiated among diverse actors.
Sure.
And that negotiation has to acknowledge their different historical narratives, their different concepts of what's legitimate. Stability, he emphasizes, requires this delicate balance between power, the ability to influence or coerce, and legitimacy, the acceptance of that power by others. If power is used without perceived legitimacy, it ultimately just leads to instability and rebellion.
Right.
Kissinger also warns against, sort of, utopianism. He states very clearly that order is not the same thing as peace. It's about managing inevitable conflicts, not eliminating them entirely.
So it's more about a pragmatic approach, coexistence and conflict management, rather than striving for some perfect conflict-free world, almost like recognizing human nature in international relations.
Exactly. He's very much a realist in that sense. And within this framework, he sees a special role for the U.S., not as a hegemon, not as the sole superpower imposing its will, but more as a convener of cooperation among the great powers. The future stability of the international system, for Kissinger, really depends on successfully reconciling these different civilizational visions into a pluralistic but cooperative system. It's about finding common ground, shared interests, despite fundamental differences, especially to address shared challenges like these new technological threats.
Henry Kissinger's world order, it really is a grand reflection on how civilizations understand power and legitimacy. It offers some crucial insights, I think, into how a stable global system might emerge in our diverse, multipolar, and technologically disruptive age. It makes you realize just how many different lenses there are through which nations view the world, and how challenging it is to find common ground when the very foundation of order means different things to different people.
And that leads right to a provocative thought for you to ponder. Given these deeply ingrained historical and cultural visions of order that Kissinger describes, what specific practical steps might a pluralistic but cooperative system truly require from global leaders today? And how might that look fundamentally different from the Westphalian system we've known for centuries? What specific concessions or maybe adaptations might you prioritize in building that kind of truly global order?
Powerful questions to consider. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Henry Kissinger's world order. We hope it encourages you to continue exploring these incredibly complex and, frankly, vital ideas.